Hello, and welcome to another stream. We are gonna be talking all about, what's wrong with your webtoon? Like, what are you doing wrong? Why is it not picking up traction? What's happening? Like, how can I make my webtoon entry the most exciting and interesting version that it can be? Because, a lot of us are trying to win out here. Not me personally, but, if y'all are trying to do it, I fully support it. As always, pause the disclaimer to read it. You know what it says. So let's just go ahead and talk about this. Let's dive right in. So to really understand this, I feel like you have to start from the beginning. Like, so many people drop off of your webtoon because the beginning is not interesting. And it's probably not interesting for a number of reasons. And we could like sit here and debate that all day long, like too much exposition, not interesting characters. Like, there's so many things that I could list that's wrong with an entry from the beginning. But this, what we're going to do in this video is kind of focus on like how you can make something really interesting to begin with. So how complicated is the beginning of your series? Like, is it, heavy on lore? Is it heavy on exposition? Like, what's going on with this story? I think the most important thing to remember when first introducing your story is to simplify. Although your story might have like grand or lofty ambitions, it might be a type of story that's like very complicated, very deep. It has to start from the tiniest seed. Like, you might be trying to grow a redwood, but it's got to start as a seed first. And I feel so many webtoons try to cram so much exposition, even if it's done in a fun way sometimes. At the end of the day, it's still exposition. So many people try and cram exposition down your throat that it just doesn't work. So take a step back and look at what you're trying to convey to the audience in the very beginning so they can have a good understanding of what you're trying to make. This is where I say focus on a scene. So if you study any sort of webtoons, like you really sit down and try and analyze the formula, from what I've understood, a lot of them kind of focus on a scene and like building off of the scene. It's pretty rare. There are a few occurrences that I've seen where it does kind of have like an exposition dump in the beginning, but it's very, very rare and it's very, very minimal exposition. So you've really got to focus on like crafting this scene in a way that it's going to convey a number of things that are important to the audience and really hook them. Now, hooking an audience, so many people I think talk about the fact that they try to hook them within 3 episodes. I personally feel that you should try and hook your reader within the first episode. And if we really get into it, I feel like you should try and hook your reader from within the first 5 panels of an episode. And let me explain this. A couple of people I've talked to that I'm friends with are like exclusively readers. Like, that's all they do. A few of them have told me within a few panels they've been turned off of webtoons. And that could be like a really picky reader. Like, I could see that being your argument. But I also think it's important to understand that every panel in the beginning of a story is important. Every like bubble of dialogue, every text, everything that's in the story is super important, and being able to convey something to the reader that's going to keep them moving forward in a story. So like in novels, you think about this as like a page turning sort of concept. You want every page to be like filled enough where it doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like I can't get enough of this. I need to get to the next page to find out what's happening. And so for webtoons, I think I need to get to the next panel to find out what's happening. And something that I thought was really interesting that I liked was in our earlier video that we did where we were reviewing what a webtoon editor said and how they talked about every few panels, they try and make sure that there's something of interest to the audience. So like maybe for a romance series, we could obviously think about the trope of, guy in 6-pack. Like every few panels, are we showing off like his physique? Are we showing off his hotness or whatever? Or maybe, you could do the same concept for like a woman. But obviously we're talking about webtoons, so we know what the real is here. But so that's where I'm like, okay, opening up your story, simplify, strip away all of the exposition, Focus on a specific scene that's going to hook the readers. And now this is where you have to begin to create a story that's going to get the readers curious about what's going to happen. And to some people, that might sound like, okay, I need the story to kind of be something that is really explosive. But that's not the case. Like, curiosity can be triggered from some of the most simplest things, and it can be triggered from, an interaction between two characters that opens up a question. So you really want the readers to start trying to piece together things as they're reading. So it could be something as simple as like leaving out some information for the reader. So a good example of this, where they did the opposite, they gave the reader the information, would be Suit of Armor. It does not show the fact that she's a fairy, I think, until the end of the episode or whatever. But that's something where it could have gone the opposite route, and that could have been something that's hidden, where the reader is trying to figure out, like, what's her deal? Why is she different? Why is she unique? And so there's a number of ways to build intrigue. That's just an example. And so when these questions rise in the reader's mind, it makes them want to kind of like figure out the mystery, figure out what's going on. Do not give them the answer in the next panel or within the next few episodes. Like, you want them to be hooked on this question or questions where they continuously move forward trying to figure out why this is happening. Like, what is happening? Did I figure it out? Did I crack the code? And so there are a number of examples of stories that do this really well. And I tried to pick stories that specifically focus on setting up questions in readers' minds. And I tried to think of stories that kind of go across all genres, except for comedy. Like, I'm not a big comedy reader, so I apologize if you're entering for comedy. I'll do better in the future. But I just could not find any comedy series that set up a question that pushes the story forward, where people are coming back for that specific question. But for example, like with Everything is Fine, you think about the fact that one of the things that instantly the reader would think before they even read the series, a question that formulates in their mind, is, why are they wearing cat heads? And that is part of the reason why I personally picked up Everything is Fine. I wanted to know why these adorable cat masks or cat heads or cat people were in this webtoon. And then when I opened up the webtoon and I started reading, I kind of still don't know. I'm like, dude, we're 2 seasons in. Why are they wearing the masks? Like, I know they're forced to do it, but what's the point? So that's a really good example of visual intrigue for the reader, where it kind of sets up something that's really odd and you can pull them in that way. Another example is obviously like tried and true, what's going on right now with anime, it's Solo Leveling. So Solo Leveling sets up the question of like, why did this guy unlock this power? That sort of thing. Like, how is he leveling? All of that. Like, there's a bunch of intrigue that comes from that with that sort of power system genre fantasy. So that's something you can always consider too, is the genre that you're telling your story in. Like, how is it creating these moments of questions to keep pulling the reader along the journey of the story that you're trying to create. And so obviously I'm not a huge romance storyteller, but I do think that Mafia Nanny sets up a lot of interesting questions with the main lead as far as her backstory. Not necessarily about the romance, but it does have a lot of intrigue about her as a person and her connection to the male lead. So you have a lot of moments where the audience is trying to piece together what's going on and figure out how this story is like impacting how the two characters and their dynamic is impacting the readers, and the story is being developed around that mystery. So there's a bunch of stories that are listed here. I would say almost one for everyone's genre. So if you're doing thriller, I included the The guy upstairs, I think that sets up an excellent beginning. And then the Masked Queen, I think kind of leans itself on the like high fantasy, more drama side. So if you want to look at some good examples, these are listed here to help you be able to craft your story and your genre, and then be able to keep building on those moments and asking those questions and setting up scenes that are actually interesting within the first 3 episodes, where the reader is really being hooked in every episode. So, here are some key things to kind of think about when you're kind of crafting this story and figuring out exactly what you want to do. And it's so important to understand, I thought, these 5 things. So, your setting, your time period, the genre, the tone, and the point of view. So, if we're talking about setting, you might think, well, they can literally see the setting. Yes, they can, but the setting can also add tension to the story. So, like in Everything is Fine, because everything is so normal and so similar and same, it gives the vibe of like a Stepford Wife type of story where things are so normal that the setting makes it seem strange. And so that's an element where I thought setting was used really well, in the sense of it adds to the overall tone of what you're trying to create, more than just a pretty building or like a gothic sort of cathedral setting where like these things evoked immediate tones. You want to be thinking about like, how is the setting going to impact the reader? What are they going to gather from what I'm creating? So then we think about the time period, and time period is important for a number of things. So if you're a fantasy writer, you can kind of skirt around time period because you make up your own time period and you just do whatever you want. But for like genre pieces or pieces that are told in a more realistic setting, what they have access to impacts the story a lot. So you think about stories like Violet Evergarden, where they don't have necessarily the telephone, like they're still using letters as the main means of communication between people who are far away. So this really impacts the relationships between characters not being able to speak to each other. So it's really important to consider like how I'm going to craft the story with the technology that's available to them, which can add a lot of interest to the story. It's just little things that aren't really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, but when you think about it, it really impacts how the story can be told. So then we think about genre. Now here's the funny thing about genre. Almost every story can be considered, in my opinion, like a multi-genre type story. So it's really important to understand like what your genre requires. So if you're telling a story and it's about a group of kids that are in a high school and they're solving crimes or solving mysteries, well, that could kind of fall into any category. If it's a romance, then they're solving crimes and solving mysteries, but the main focus is on the dynamics and the relationships between the characters, which means that the focus is going to be more about their personal connections than it is about solving the mysteries. Whereas if this was like an action story, it's going to be about them fighting the ghosts, fighting, whatever monsters appear. So it's super, super important to understand that your story's genre kind of dictates the type of reader and what the reader expects from that genre. So if I'm reading a romance story and all they're doing is fighting, and then every once in a while maybe there's like a handhold or a kiss, it's not a romance story. Understand who the story is going to be targeting. Next is the tone. So we've been talking about tone quite a bit, in my opinion, but I think tone is so important to set up from the first episode. So this could be your opening panel. It could be, is it an eerie feeling? Is it a lighthearted feeling? Like, there's a lot that can be conveyed just from the first few opening panels that sets the tone to either make the reader feel like this is going to be a light or a deep story. And when we think about some of the stories that I mentioned earlier, like the Masked Queen, it sets up right from the very beginning that this is going to be a more moody or dark story that's going to have a lot of I don't want to say scary, but tense moments. So it's really, really important to get the tone right for the story. That impacts your reader as well. So that's something to think about. So when you're crafting your story, does it even have a tone? Did the tone occur by accident, or was it something that you put some thought into and you really made sure that the dialogue, that the background images, and that the characters reflect that? So a good example, I think, of a story that has usually the same type of tone is like a Tim Burton movie. Like all of those stories kind of have like an eerie feeling to them. And so that's a perfect example of what are you trying to craft. Now, point of view. Okay. So this is where I think everybody needs to take like a moment and just understand that the main character that you have may not be the best character to tell the story that you're creating. And I would encourage anyone who is trying to enter this contest right now, especially if you had something that you worked on before, write the story from another character's point of view and see if it's more interesting from that character's point of view opposed to the point of view that you were telling it from. And that will help you to determine how interesting your main character is. It'll help you also determine if like your character is possibly more of a passive protagonist or if they're actively having a role in their own story. So a nice example, I think, or a nice like homework assignment that I found to always be beneficial is like writing the story from the villain's perspective, because the villain's perspective is obviously going to be very active in the story because they're working so much against the protagonist. And so it helps you to kind of have a nice perspective of like what an active character would be doing if you're not used to writing something like that. And then I would say let other people read the two different versions and let them tell you like which one is more entertaining and why. Like, was it the character? Was it the fact that the other character was like actively doing things? Was it the fact that the plot just seemed to be like very much shielding this character? So there's a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about who my main character is and what point of view I want to go with. This could also lead you to going down the road that I like, which is a multi-POV story where there are like a bunch of duality, because sometimes like a main lead cannot hold the story on their own. They need a little help. And there are tons of stories that are multi-POV now. I should say there's probably always been a bunch of stories that are multi-POV, but what I really mean is there's more stories ever, I think, that have multiple viewpoints than before. We think of things like Game of Thrones. You think of I'm blanking. Like literally, I had it's with the fairies. Like it was a new series on Netflix, and it had like 6 different girls, and it covered all of their POVs. But like stories like that, where you have a large cast, and the whole cast helps to support the plot and the story and move it forward. Even though one character might be more important than all of the others, you still have all the others doing work to carry the tension and interest of the story. All right, so my question to the community for this video is, how do you structure your story? I am super curious about this. Like, are you very much, I want to give them the lore of the world and then move into what I think is most important? Are you a prologue person where you need to give them a moment in history before moving forward? Or do you just dive right into the scene? Do you go ahead and build off of a very interest-arousing, hook-worthy scene and build from there? Let me know. Comment down below. The screen, I'm doing my creator shout out. It is to the creator of Unseen Love. They go by Shy, Sweet, and Sour, and it is a romance and heartwarming story. Please check it out. They are amazing, and they've been so supportive of the channel. I really appreciate them. Also, if you want some extra content, Patreon is coming. Well, not coming, but the Patreon video is coming out this month. We're going to be looking at what I'm working on behind the scenes for the upcoming contest. So if you want to see more of that, you want to see what I'm working on my stuff, then come on over to Patreon. And thank you to my patrons. Really appreciate all of you guys. Y'all have been so amazing. Thank you for the support. And with that, I will catch you all in the next video.